Jazz hands. Come on, everybody, do the jazz hands. It's 1920. It's the Roaring Twenties. What an amazing time in America. What a great time to be alive. I talk to so many people just, in casual conversation that like, what time would you love to be alive? And a lot of them say the 1920s because the way they dressed and they got to go to speakeasies and they were partying all the time. However, we forget sometimes that the Roaring Twenties actually took place during Prohibition. And Prohibition is that time America outlawed booze. It was illegal to sell or buy alcohol or transport it or possess it and produce it. I'm going to read the 18th Amendment from the United States. Not the entire thing. I'm sure that would put everybody to sleep. I'm just going to read Section 1. The 18th Amendment finally was passed in 1919. And it goes like this. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. I'm not even sure what that said. I don't know why do they write like that? Can you just say, hey, you can't sell it, transport it, or produce it? You don't have to put all those weird words in there. It's almost like they just want to confuse people. Well, that's what we call legal jargon. Anyways, alcohol was illegal in 1919, but it didn't just happen overnight. Okay, this movement to outlaw booze in America happened 80 years before. So we're going to go back to 1840. And because there's so much content on this topic, and I try to jam it in, we are going to do this in two parts. So this is part one of our Prohibition episode. So if we go back to 1840, a movement started forming within the churches. And this was a movement led by women. And at this time, women didn't even have the right to vote. They had very few marital rights or community rights, but somehow they started evolving a voice to point the finger at society and say, we are filled with moral behavior, and this is happening because of alcohol. And at the same time that this movement started, which would come to be known as the temperance movement, abolitionists started also pointing out immoral behaviors in the form of slavery, right? So slavery is bad. Our society is falling apart. Alcohol is bad. It creates bad behavior and crushes the family system and communities. And our society at that point was faith-based, family-based, and community-based. We were settled. We became America in 1776. And from that time into the 1840s, it was basically farm your land, share and trade, control your own destiny, work hard, go to church. And we were Protestant. That's what this country was founded on. And Protestant religion has denominations like, it's a Christian religion with denominations like Baptism, Methodist, Episcopalian. It wasn't Catholicism whatsoever. And it was kind of ingrained in our society. And we know today there's supposed to be a separation between church and state, but God was written in everything that our founding fathers developed to help shape our country, right? In God we trust. So this was how society was. So when these women were forming church groups and starting to point out, like, look what's going on. People are starting to get hurt in the home. Men are drinking. They are now stepping away from farming their land all day to go to a saloon and drink. And now the saloons were a place where only men could go. They drank alone, no women there. I'm not sure if women were outlawed from there, but a lot of the research shows that they weren't really allowed there. And if they had to come there, they had to come in through the side door. And the only women that were allowed in many saloons were prostitutes, because most saloons, not most, but a lot, were connected to brothels. So now men were drinking away their income, the time they could be on the farm, the time they could be at church or with their family, and then they're paying for prostitutes and going broke. And this wasn't everybody, but it was a big enough problem across American society in the 1840s that a few things started to happen. A couple states actually outlawed drinking, and that includes Massachusetts and Maine and some southern states. So this movement was gaining traction. These women were spreading the word. Newspaper articles started talking about it and highlighting deviant behavior and the negative sides of drinking. So now politicians started talking about it. And then some men realized what they were, you realize the anguish and pain they were causing and how they were failing themselves, their families, and their responsibility to produce an income, manage their farm or whatever profession it was they did. And so some men formed a group called the Washingtonians. Washingtonians. That's a hard one to say. That little G in there, Washington. Washingtonians. I challenge you to take 5 seconds to say it. Washingtonians. I can't get that G in there. Anyhow, I digress. So this group was like what you think of today as AA, right? Only there was no religion tied to it, but it started in Washington, D.C., and eventually had 25,000 members around 1846, 1847. And for the first time, men were trying to start a movement to quit alcohol, and they were actually sharing their stories together and being like vulnerable to other men, which was like a no-no in the way the construct of a male was in American society. The males in American society were tough, and they were hunters, and they were farmers, and they didn't show too much emotion, and they led the household and the community. But here was men admitting that, wow, we have a problem, and look what it's doing. Because some of the consequences of drinking back then were obviously, spending all the money, but a lot of men were getting drunk and just beating their family, their wives and their kids. And there was no protections or laws in place to prevent that or to give consequences and punishment for men that behaved like that. So this was really creating some issues. People started writing articles in newspapers, and then plays were formed, right? And because we didn't have TV or movies back then, the small theater was taking place in some of these communities, and some of the popular plays were highlighting the dangers of alcohol and what a man would do when he was drunk. And so as more plays spread, more people were learning about it. So whether they knew what was happening or not, they were starting to understand it better. So as this movement grew and grew, something shut it down. It was the Civil War. So in 1861, the Civil War starts, and now any other movements or ideas or changes to laws or life or regulations was going to be put aside because this country was battling to free the slaves. Or if you were from the southern states, it's not about slavery, it's about states' rights. Yeah, states' rights to own slaves. So the abolitionist movement obviously gained more steam than the temperance movement, but it would create some bigger problems. We have a great episode on the Civil War where we discuss the first opiate epidemic that came out of the war unintentionally. So we never saw a medical crisis like that. We had over 750,000 casualties, right? And a lot of it was like dismemberment, arms and legs and limbs, and they're sawing off your leg because you got like shrapnel in it. It was horrible. So there was a massive amount of opium and morphine being used. And that created long-term addiction for many of the soldiers. And this stuff was legal. You didn't need to get those drugs from a doctor back then. But it also didn't just help with the pain they were going through from war. Many people saw how it helped with their mental health and the trauma they were going through from being part of the war. So obviously alcohol was readily available everywhere, and that substance became even more important for the men of the Civil War era because they drank. They drank on the way to battle, they drank after battle, and then certainly after the war, they drank to suppress the memories of the war, or in some cases, the pain. So our society had a couple 100,000 people addicted to opiates, and then an unknown amount of unconscious alcoholics or straight up alcoholics. So the Civil War just made the societal issues worse and the drinking problems worse. So when the war ends, we go through a period in America known as Reconstruction, right? That's like, oh shit, we made a mess. Mom and dad are gonna be home this weekend. We better clean up this house, paint the walls, fix this thing. Let's put it back together. It's just a side note. I remember doing that once when I was in high school. And like, I remember my parents coming home and like, did you guys have a party? This house is cleaner than it's ever been. Like it was even more clean than when she had cleaned it. But that was kind of like Reconstruction. We were trying to put the lipstick on the pig, clean our country back up. And then we had to deal with some serious issues, right? Like there was several million slaves that were now free. Where were they going to go? We just overnight, millions of people add to the population, right? So at the time, the government was like, we're going to give you 40 acres and a mule. Go settle your land, be an American. You're one of us now. Well, that idea and law wasn't going to last very long. So what happened was the same government with pressure came back and repealed that. So some former slaves actually settled their new government promised land and it was pulled out from under them. So millions of people from the South, slaves, started flocking cities and heading north. Millions of soldiers were going back to either broken homes, shattered families, destroyed towns and industry, and trying to pick up the pieces of their lives. And so the one thing all of these people had in common was they drank. And they drank to mask the stress of the society that has fallen apart. So it was a painful, dark time. America started rebuilding railroads, connecting lines where we could transfer information through the wire back to the South that were cut off because of the war. Cities were being sort of rebuilt a little bit, and then it created a little bit of an expansion. But one thing that happened was people were being incentivized to head west. So we had pioneers. I mean, people had been going pre-Civil War, but now like, oh, what else are you going to do? The war is over. This place sucks. Let's go west. And as they traveled out west, their wagons filled with alcohol, right? And a lot of people drank alcohol prior to the Civil War and at this time because honestly, they didn't know any better. It wasn't like today. Like my daughter walks around like the mall with her giant Stanley water and everybody's got one and it looks like a cult. Like we're drinking water because it's healthy. Back then, the water wasn't, they didn't know it was a thing. And a lot of times, much like the ancient civilizations we discussed in the show, the water wasn't actually that healthy or safe to drink because of molecules and bacteria that could ultimately make you sick. So the alcohol would mask some of that. And just like for thousands of years, people were drinking alcohol just because that was the beverage that was safe to drink, minus all the problems it would create later. So another thing that evolved out of the Reconstruction period as we get into the 1870s now, the war ends in about 1865, is that temperance movement that was happening before the war reappears. And it reappears in a much more significant manner with many more members. So a group of women with a faith-based motive at this point started going around the country and highlighting the drinking issues and the problems. And because they started gaining traction, they had like 250,000 members of something that would be known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And they had all the moral answers for everything. And these women wanted to fix society because they felt like it was lost, that we were full of sin and we were heading in the wrong direction. And then there was like kids starving in the street. So some of the issues they had were like seriously legitimate things that needed to be fixed, right? They wanted to help women get out of prostitution to start a better life. So they did a lot of positive things. But because there was so many of them and they kept growing, because they had like 3 or 4 really good orators that could get up and speak and motivate people. And even though women still couldn't vote at this time, they had a lot of power in numbers and they could embarrass people. They were using the press to get their message out. And so their husbands or men or children in the community started following some of their beliefs. So now society started shifting towards, yes, alcohol is bad. And now they're using alcohol to blame on everything. They're like, look at the slaves moving in the cities. They're drinking and doing drugs. All these veterans that aren't being taken care of from the war, they're drinking heavily. And now as we expand out west, there's like little towns popping up. And in those towns, there's a general store where you can hook your horse up, get some water. Your horse could probably drink the water more safely. Then you could go to a little church if it was a big tent with a preacher in it, or you go to the saloon, which was like the hub of every town during expansion. And usually the guy that ran the saloon was like the mayor or the most popular guy in town because he knew everybody. And of course, he controlled the substance everybody wanted, right? And that was a place where men went to socialize and talk about, hey, there's gold in them thar hills, or just expansion ideas or politics. And it was really the fabric of society and the main meeting place. Also, the theaters we spoke about earlier began to become bigger productions. And one of the most famous plays, and I wish I could remember the name of it, is basically a story about this alcoholic can't quit drinking for his family, even though they beg him to. And his little daughter comes into the bar, and the guy he's drinking with throws something, hits the girl in the head, and kills her. And this is a very emotional play. Just like when you watch the movie Titanic, at least me, you're like, Jack. Like, it really moves you. And there wasn't a lot of options for emotional, stimulating entertainment back then. So this play was fairly significant as it traveled around the country because nobody wanted to be in that life. And to those people, they would turn to each other like, this is unbelievable. We got to outlaw alcohol. So the women's Christian temperance movements really capitalized on this. And another thing they did was they started swaying and influencing their power at the ballot box. Even though they couldn't vote, they were putting pressure on townspeople and the men were starting to vote in the way they were pushing them because it would look silly if they agreed that it's okay to have a daughter killed or a woman beat, right? And society to fall apart, and they wouldn't look Christian if they continued with this deviant behavior of consuming alcohol. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union started like getting their hands in textbooks for school, right? They wanted to teach the next generation how bad drinking is. And they would put in these textbooks, they would list all the things we know today why alcoholism is bad. But then they'd add things in there like, if you drink too much, you'll self-combustulate, you'll blow up, you'll burn on fire, which is bullshit. So they did put a bunch of bullshit in there, but it was just more things they did to start rolling the ball forward to ban alcohol. And now by the 1880s, a lot of things started changing in America. A lot of towns, counties, or states, more of them started outlawing alcohol because of this movement. And then the development and growth of cities starts expanding, like it just goes crazy. It's like an exponential growth. There's a statistic before the Civil War, Chicago had about 300,000 people. This is pretty big for back before 1860. By the mid 1870s, there was almost 2 million people just in Chicago. So imagine the data from New York or Washington, D.C., just in the slaves going up to Washington and Baltimore and then southern cities. These cities were expanding at such a rapid pace. So it created jobs as we get into the 1880s, 1890s. Another thing that was important to talk about when you're looking back at Prohibition was the story that got a lot of attention of a woman named Carrie Nation. Now, this was like in the early 1880s into the 1890s, I believe. It's in that period. Now, Carrie Nation isn't her real name. I'm pretty sure it's her stage name. She was divorced from an alcoholic, and then her next husband, I believe, died of alcoholism or alcohol-related behavior, and she was a little messed up in the head. So she was, her first incident was in Kansas, and I think there was like a lot of lead in the water there because her behavior is nuts. So she thought she had this divine inspiration from God to go and enforce the laws of Kansas because their alcohol was illegal, but nobody was enforcing it. People were still drinking in bars, but it was illegal. So she first went out with a bunch of stones, walked in the bar, and just started shattering stuff with the stones. And when she walked in the bar, and she was like a bigger woman, she was like, pretty, like a big stature and intimidating looking for a woman of the day. And the men were just like, oh my God, like, okay, do your thing. So she does that. People are like, that was crazy. Then she does it again. And then they're like, dude, you got to stop doing it. And nothing happens. These bars are still open. So she believes like God gave her the answer to take this hatchet that she has. A hatchet. Like you chop freaking wood in your backyard. Now she went in bars and she do something called the hatchetification. And she started using the hatchet and destroying the bars and the liquor and the mirrors and everything. And then she started getting arrested. I think she was arrested over the course of her run like a dozen times. But she got hundreds of other women to follow her. So where the Women's Christian Temperance Union was going to these saloons and kneeling and praying and say, please send our men home. Please close the doors of your saloon. Carrie Nation was going in there and shit up. Like, she said, no way, girl. Boom, boom. She was hatcheting up, and it drew a lot of attention. And it just added gasoline to the fire of why this nation's got to get rid of alcohol. The women are getting emotional about it. The men are sitting and drinking all day. Now, that doesn't cover 100% of society, but it's a significant amount of the population so that these states keep pushing more and more laws to outlaw alcohol. So as we get into like the late 80s into the 1890s, these cities are going up. We need more workers. Now there's jobs in the cities, right? And now the farmers are starting to do real well because they got to produce crops to feed all the people that are in the cities and working. You got little kids working. They're working a ridiculous amount of hours and days. And then immigration starts happening, like boatloads of people. I think our country, we grew like somewhere between 15 and 21 million people in just 2 decades in the American population just to develop the cities. And most of them came through New York City. So it was a crazy place. But these immigrants brought with them a bunch of things that pissed off the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it helped create a couple new groups. One that was already doing their little dark stuff, but it would get bigger. So the first one was the KKK, which really formed a reconstruction to keep those black people down. We don't want free slaves. They were hanging them and burning across their shit bags that wear the white cloaks because they're too embarrassed to show their faces about their unrealistic views of the world because they're just angry and mean people. But by the time Prohibition would get voted in, the KKK would have 3 million members, which is crazy. It's crazy. And they weren't just doing it, their shit against black people. They started blaming these immigrants that were coming off the boat, right? And they did this because they were German, Italian, and Irish. And what they brought with them was Catholicism. So now they were all Catholic. So now they had to build their own churches. And now the Protestant, the Women's Christian movement didn't like that. So that movement, the Women's Christian movement, started blaming them. The KKK started blaming them. And the other thing they brought was beer. The Germans love their beer. Some of our biggest brewers would be Germans. Okay. And they also brought a style of socializing that really didn't happen. It may have happened a little bit, but men go to saloons, they drink, they talk this. But a lot of these Europeans were boisterous. And when they drank, they sang songs and they socialized and they laughed and they were loud. And it just was different than the way the Americans had their social acumen. So people didn't like it because it was different, no matter how much fun it looked. So these groups, the KKK and the Women's Christian movement, so it went from, this is faith-based, the country's becoming immoral, to look what these people are doing to our country. It's their fault. We cannot have alcohol here anymore. Look what it's doing. And then the KKK did the same thing. So now you had all these women who still couldn't vote at the turn of the century. And then the KKK, which was all men, and they certainly could vote. And a lot of those men probably were already politicians, lawyers, leaders, and outside of their cloaks, respected members of the American society. So now shit's going down, right? Because there's real power and voices here. And then another group formed in the late 19th century, and this group would be paramount in toppling any part of society wanted to keep drinking. And that was called the Anti-Saloon League. And what's important about them is they become like the first like political action committee known as a PAC, right? And so in our modern politics, there's always a lot of debates about how can a PAC, like if I'm running for something, I can't say and do certain things, but a PAC can because I got nothing to do with it, even though I know it's for me, right? And they can spend all this money. And so what these PACs started to do was threaten politicians. They had so many members and so much power and money. And the guy that ran the Anti-Saloon League with the last name of Wheeler was a lawyer. He was a smart guy. And he was like intrinsically motivated to outlaw alcohol because of his own traumatic experiences as a child, the things he saw happen on his farm. And I think he got hit in the face with a pitchfork and some other stuff. But he was intelligent, motivated, and had Christian values for whatever that meant at the day. So these three groups at the turn of the century were blaming immigrants, pushing this. Now the politicians started getting scared. Like a lot of them like, okay, we don't know what to do. Like we don't want to outlaw alcohol. We all drink. And they didn't care. But something else was happening to America. Our society was changing. It would forever be changed because of the rapid expansion of the city and the railroads, right? And the amount of people coming in that could employ these factories to produce more products so we can develop more things, capitalism started to flourish, right? And so the rich people, like the Carnegies and the Astors, right, they started getting so ridiculously wealthy and people were working for them. So we start seeing America turn from, this is my farm, my family, my community, my church, I control my destiny, to now a lot of Americans, we're now relying on a paycheck from these companies, right? Because now it's a paycheck system of capitalism. You pay me shit to work my ass off so you can get rich. I can barely feed my family, build a house. There was no middle class at this point. So we got divided into two classes in America, the haves and the have-nots. And even though it wasn't dirt poor, well, it was for a lot of people. Like a lot of the former slaves couldn't even get jobs. Nobody wanted them around. In fact, they had to go back to like plantations and fields and farms. And they had basically like, hey, I'll work for you, sort of like I did. Just don't beat me, but I need a place to live. So like, oh yeah, we have this old slave quarters. You guys can just move your family in there and you just do what we said. Well, that's slavery. So a lot of slaves were like, oh shit, we got to go back to slavery, right? So they had to work, so they had a place to live and they had to get food for their families. So as society started rolling, it was leaving people behind, but it was creating a system where people relied on it. It relied on it. And then these very wealthy people, and it wasn't a lot of them, they were controlling everything. They had more power than the United States government. They formed these trusts. And this is where capitalism really starts here. I know it's not drug related, but it's important for what's about to happen. Like they create these trusts. And these trusts, now you got like JP Morgan, like you think of, the investment firm. Well, that started with this dude right here. This trust controlled the pricing of everything. So even though we all have a steel company, let's agree that this is going to be the price of steel, right? So nobody else can come along, try to undercut us or do anything. Boom, this is the price of steel. This is the price of eggs. This is how much a railroad ticket costs. So these trusts basically control the price of everything so they could get richer and no one could come compete with them, which is kind of like a monopoly, right? We didn't get there yet in society, but it didn't give people a chance to ever get out of their situation. So it became a capitalism society that actually enslaved people to work for the man, as they'd say in the 1960s. But literally, you were working for a paycheck. You relied on that rich guy to give you a paycheck, and you had nowhere else to go because the other rich guy was playing the same game. So you could work for him, or you could be one of the few lucky ones that invent something, or you got a job, you wrote a book that took off. There were rare opportunities, but that's like writing a hit song today. Everybody can sing and play the guitar, but like 5 people will make it. It's very difficult. And that's how capitalism really formed, and the foundations of it and solidified it. It just got everybody to rely on the system. And then along comes a man in the early 1900s. He rides along on his horse with his mustache. If you watch the movie Night at the Museum, it's Teddy Roosevelt, man. This guy is a character, and he's from a very wealthy family, right? But Teddy Roosevelt, he's got a conscience and empathy for it. He's like traveled the world, and he's seen the plight of man in many situations, and he was an adventurer, but he also was a narcissist, craving attention. So he liked to do good to feel good, right? And that's okay. That's what a lot of philanthropists do. Look at Bill Gates, right? And so he started saying, wait a second, we got to do something about this. We can't have these people having more power than the government. So as the U.S. president and Congress, the Senate, we need to look at these trusts, and we need to break this. And we cannot have 12-year-old children working in a factory 15 hours a day in conditions that are crazy. So he started doing things that sort of like it wasn't the stuff his fifth cousin would do later on in the 1930s, FDR, but he started trying to buck the growth of dark capitalism in America. And if he didn't come along, who knows what our country would be? It would just be a handful of people, and it is in some sense controlling everything, and we're all just slaves to it, almost like the kings of Europe, where everybody just works around the castle and like, here's your bread, oh, thank you, right? And seriously, that's what it was like. So he did a good job trying to buck some of this, which made him hated by many, loved by some. But during this time, it was very stressful, and these workers, the immigrants and the Americans, they were just drinking before work, drinking at lunch, drinking after work, drinking all the time, drinking in the streets. And it became a huge problem in the cities. So as we get to about like 1910-ish, and we're moving, society's cruising, it is flying. The growth of America is just unbelievable. We got automobiles, evolving, just technology is crazy. It's probably the fastest growth period ever. And also for some of these social structures, something like that never happened, where just a little bit he tried to protect people. Not that much. That wouldn't come till later. But this era is known as the Progressive Era. But these groups had all the power. They didn't have the money. But guys that didn't drink, that were wealthy, that were some of these trust owners, they would just give the anti-saloon money. They didn't care. But where they did care was the people that owned liquor companies and distilleries, right? And breweries. Like, we don't want this to happen. We'll be out of business. And what about all these workers? And so as we get over the 1910s, as we set up Prohibition and set the stage of why this all happens, Congress is really considering taking this up. In fact, they started doing things to protect against other substances about this time. In 1914, they passed the Harrison Act, which finally said, okay, everybody, you can't buy heroin and cocaine and opium at the stores anymore. You just can't do it. It's just not going well. We have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people addicted to drugs. And this had nothing to do with prohibition or alcohol, but that was a sign like, okay, regulations on society are coming. And so in 1914, the Harrison Act passes. But these guys are like, the tax on alcohol is how we fund most of the federal government. It's literally 40% of our budget is the tax on the alcohol industry and the hospitality industry, because we don't tax people that work, right? Even though they make like $1 a day or whatever ridiculous thing it is, we're not taxing that yet. So they finally, because of the Women's Christian Temperance Union's push and the Anti-Saloon League's creativity and lobbying and PAC power, in 1916, for the first time, the United States passes the income tax. So now they're taxing me, man. Oh, now I'm working. And now, like forever, you're just arguing about more tax, less tax, more tax, less tax. So now your paycheck's getting taxed, the income tax occurs, and that revenue can offset the hospitality and liquor industry. So now these politicians, which already fear these groups, here's an example. The Anti-Saloon League went into a couple states and to like all the state congressmen and the national senators, congressmen, like, you're going to present prohibition. You're going to present outlawing alcohol. If you do not, the next election, you will not be in power. We have the power to get you voted out. Oh, bullshit. So some people are like, we don't believe you. We want drinking. They go. So this anti-saloon group got 70 people removed, voted out of power, lifetime guys, right? And the people now, politicians got scared. Like, we don't want to lose power. Like, one thing politicians, whether they're back then, it was Democrat, Republican, the Labor Party, the Prohibition Party, it didn't matter what side you're on. One thing they can all agree on is they love power, because with power comes the backroom corruption, inside information, so they can get wealthy. And that still exists today. It's like ridiculous today. Everybody that is in Congress or Senate knows what's going to happen in an industry before we do. And they're allowed to invest in that or sell their assets in that to save a bad investment. That's just crazy. It's nuts. It's just so stupid, but that's power, right? You get that. That's why if you make 180 grand a year as a senator or whatever it is today, they're all millionaires because of that insider information power and PACs giving them money and favors. So this is what was happening back then with the anti-saloon league. So they're like, I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican or any of these other parties. I don't even care if you drink. You're going to vote for this legislation. And now that the anti-saloon league helped push over the income tax, we've got the revenue. No more excuses, or you're all out of power. Okay. So in 1917, the Volstead Act gets brought up, like the details of it. Congress passes prohibition. And in there's a clause that says you have 6 years to get it passed as law. So it's got to go to the Senate, get signed by the president. So finally, in 1917, after 80 years and a couple generations of the temperance movement, right, and led by mostly faith-based women, a little help from the disgusting KKK, and a smart lawyer and the power of lobbying of the anti-saloon league, it passes. And then less than 2 years later, it goes to the Senate. It goes to the desk of Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time. He vetoes it. He's like, no way, we can't do this. And Congress ratifies it by overpowering the Senate, overpowering the president's veto, and now it becomes law. So 1919, the Volstead Act goes into place. That act says you have 1 year to prepare for this, because on January 16th, 1920, America is going dry, baby. No alcohol whatsoever. Now, there's a couple stipulations in there which are interesting, I think. Now, you could get alcohol as a prescription from your doctor. Churches could buy wine for the sacrament. There was some personal use of the amount of grapes you can have at home to create your own wine. And of course, we had to keep distilleries to manufacture for the pharmaceutical needs of alcohol, and also to create products that needed methyl alcohol, which we use today in like things like mouthwash, right? There's a lot of methyl alcohol in products that we need. So Prohibition kicks in right at the beginning of 1920. So here we go. We're going to roll into the roaring 20s. And on our next episode, we're going to talk about all the great things that happened in the roaring 20s. How did they drink? Where did they get it from? We're going to look at some of that stuff. So thanks for listening. Check out part 2 coming right up.